Hi, I'm Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. I've spent 30 years working on climate change, primarily as a management consultant with companies around the world, but also working with the IPCC and working with sustainability leaders from Stonyfield Farm to Nike to organizations like the Nature Conservancy and the Global Environment Facility. I'd like to talk with you a little bit today about something that I've been working on that might be relevant to how you in the philanthropic community are keeping your heads around what is an increasingly complicated climate change landscape. So what I'll start with is just the idea that the landscape is shifting and that the conversation is shifting. Lots of different things are going on that are affecting how people are thinking about climate change, how companies are responding to climate change, and what the opportunities are for philanthropic intervention into the climate change space. What that means is that there's more of a need for actionable knowledge. And let me just give you a very quick example of what I mean by that. Working with a Fortune 100 company, I put up the slide to the right here, which takes a look at fire risk per 1 degree C of climate change in the Western US. And this graphic by itself totally changed the nature of the conversation that I was having with that group. Suddenly, several senior people around the table said, now I get it. Now I understand why climate change is a material business issue for us, not just a corporate social responsibility issue. And that was key to carrying the conversation forward. Now, actionable knowledge isn't always that simple, but it can be. And it was from that we started building a number of years ago what we call the climate web, which is basically a massive knowledge management system with the idea of being able to get the right information to the right person at the right time to serve as actionable knowledge for them on climate change. And in effect, implementing Carla Odell's quote, "If only we knew what we know." Now, companies that have used this like it, and there's, for example, this quote that the climate web is like having 100 decision makers with you at the decision-making table, or 100 experts in all kinds of disciplines with you at the decision-making table. Now, we have not, I will say right up front, we have not specifically worked with philanthropies in the past, and I have no particular agenda for how the climate web can support the work of the philanthropic community at large or an individual philanthropy. But I'd like to explore with you some of what's in the climate web to see what ideas it might generate with you, and I would be happy to follow up on those ideas. Now, I'm going to jump right into the climate web and continue from there. So give me just a second. So now we're in the climate web, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how the software works. It's called Brain software, or how the climate web itself works. I'm just going to try and give you a quick look at some of the things that are in the climate web that I think might be of interest and of value. Now, not surprisingly, you can go and actually explore the topic of climate and philanthropy in the climate web, and we've pulled together much of the literature going back to the original 2007 report on how philanthropies can advance climate change objectives, but there's much more here in terms of different reports, in terms of news coverage of the topic, and all of this you can sort of pull up instantly because it's in the climate web or directly links you to sources outside the climate web. And we've spent a lot of time, obviously, organizing a lot of this information. But I'm sure that this isn't the information that is of particular interest to you because you're likely to know this information. So I'm going to jump and show you some of the other ways that information in the climate web might be particularly useful. So, for example, starting with some of the headings in the climate web, just to suggest the kinds of information that are in here. Now, there are thousands of these headings in the climate web, so I've picked about 50 of them, just not at random, but just the kinds of things that I suspect would be of particular interest that you'd like to be able to call up and take a look at under particular circumstances. Everything from climate ethics and morals to tipping points to the new genre of climate fiction and what role it can play in helping to tackle climate change, to the 100% renewable energy transition. You can just take a look at some of these headings. They go on and on, and they just suggest the scope of what we've pulled together here. Another thing that I'll show you is the topic of wicked problems, because we generally don't focus too much on the idea that climate change is a wicked problem, and yet that has huge implications for solving climate change. And so here you can go through and you can look at the literature, you can look at tons of stuff having to do with wicked problems and climate change, going back, for example, to the original paper that got the whole wicked problem conversation going back in 1973. You can read the paper, you can see what we've extracted from the paper, you can go down and look at relevant YouTube channels and videos that have to do with wicked problems and systems thinking. You can look at other papers and lots of relevant stuff to understanding the idea of climate change as a wicked problem and what the implications are of that for tackling climate change, because it's actually huge and we tend not to talk about it nearly enough. Then these are all things that I've just tagged here and pinned rather than spending time looking for them while you're watching the video. Here I'm just going to change the view because this one makes more sense to look at just with a normal view. You can go through and take a look at the topic or the question of climate change as an emergency, and you can jump right through to sort of tons of information organized to help answer that specific question, from risk attributions to changing probabilities and changing risks and sea level rise, etc. So it's all organized to make it easy to get to. Now I'm going to jump to one last topic here, since I'm not trying to be overwhelming. This one I'm going to change back to the new mind map view because this is a great view. And this is the topic of systemic risk, which again is one of those topics that you may not be spending a lot of attention on, but it's a conversation that is rapidly expanding in the last 4 or 5 years. This started out a number of years ago with things like Lloyd's report on food system shock, which looked at the implications of multiple breadbasket droughts at the same time. Not outrageous droughts, the droughts we're already seeing, but we've never seen them in 3 breadbaskets at the same time. And this was a very interesting report to sort of look at what the implications of that drought scenario might be for political stability, for food prices, for all sorts of things. Very interesting report. But the conversation is now going much further than that. People are actually building models having to do with climate change systemic risk specifically. This isn't just your old financial systemic risk in the financial sector. This is climate change systemic risk. And you can explore that topic in great detail in the climate web. So that is just giving you an example of a few of the lenses. That there are literally hundreds of these kinds of lenses into the climate web. One big change literally in the last month or so is with a change of the software. You can now actually download the climate web or relevant sections of the climate web to your desktop and access them there, which is using these kinds of visualization tools like the mind mapping tool. So you can actually download 20,000 hours of work on climate change to your desktop to help you advance your goals in your organization. And I'd love to chat with you about how you see the potential for this to help you with what you're doing, because our goal with the Climate Web is to try and make a difference on climate change after working in this field for 30 years. So if you go to theclimateweb.com, you can get a lot more information and take a look at the products page there. You can also find out more about us at climatographer.com, and I would be happy to continue the conversation. Thanks.